Okay, thank you very much again to Dr. Catungal for joining us today for the symposium, and we'd like to invite you to begin your live presentation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I just want to check that everything's going okay, that you can see my slides. Excellent. So once again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and to the organizers, particularly for deftly navigating the logistical challenges of organizing a symposium like this. I really appreciate how smooth it's been going, and the way that you've curated the different events and panels. So thanks very much for having me be part of it. The presentation that I am going to be presenting on today draws on research that I am currently doing in collaboration with Dr. Catungal, who many of you listened to, hopefully everyone, deliver the keynote just before me. And it is, the project is titled Mediating Communication, Asian International Students in Canada during COVID-19. I want to thank Dr. Tungohan, as well as our research assistants, Xiao Chung, Capri Kapo Kong, Shaylin McPherson, and Sarah C. For the collaboration and the opportunity to work on this project with them. I also want to thank funding from Short Explore via York University, which is enabling us to do some of this work. I'm joining you today in my capacity as an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. And UBC is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Halkominam-speaking Musqueam people. I live in the kind of shared and overlapping territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, on whose unceded territories my apartment building is located. And so I wanted to recognize that. And more broadly too, given that this is a collaborative project that involves UBC and York University international students, I also want to name that York University, as Dr. Tungohan had mentioned in her keynote, is home and what has been the traditional territory of a number of nations: the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat. And it is now also home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. It is a space that has a couple of treaties in effect governing what it means to be on these lands. This includes the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. Okay. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing research project. And it is an ongoing research project that is being continued to be conducted. And it is really quite concerned with the impacts and the relationships between COVID-19 and post-secondary education. Our focus, as the title mentions, is on the implications of COVID-19 for international students from Asia. That are at some point this year during the COVID-19 pandemic have been or continue to be enrolled at UBC and York University. And conceptually and politically, part of our interest in this project is to think about international students from Asia and how they've been impacted by COVID-19, not only through the lens of university responses, so internal institutional responses from, say, UBC and York, but also other kinds of institutional responses, such as government responses to COVID-19 in the form of border and migration controls, in the form of health and medical policies. So here we have multiple jurisdictions of policy making that are also at play, certainly at the federal, provincial, health unit, and municipal levels. We're also interested in the ways that media coverage helps shape how international students from Asia experience the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, we want to place our examination of international students from Asia from a broader context where we understand institutional media and governmental responses to COVID-19, not as coming from a blank slate, but as already been kind of preconditioned or conditioned by pre-existing contexts, including, for example, university context of neoliberalization and internationalization, and I'll say a bit more about that, the Canadian policy of multiculturalism, as well as a broader and durable history of intersecting forms and systems of social differentiation. Let me say a couple of words about our methodology. We are employing a kind of multi-pronged approach to our study of international students' experiences of COVID-19. We are creating a corpus of documents and compiling media coverage, especially as it relates to UBC and York in relation to COVID-19. And we are also, as part of this compilation, collecting formal pronouncements from all the institutions that are the main kind of sites of our study. And these formal pronouncements have to do with public communications about COVID-19, formal policy responses, as well as other kinds of communication, like media releases, tweets, etc. Alongside this, we are doing, well, let me go back to the kind of pronouncements. And this these pronouncements are diverse. They have to do with shifts in course delivery, the availability of university level supports, communication to students about non-university policies and their impacts on students, for example, or on lockdowns, et cetera. Statements about universities' commitments to anti-racism and these kinds of things. And on top of these, this method, we are also conducting focus groups with UBC and York international students from Asia. And these focus groups have been conducted by the undergraduate research assistants that I named in the beginning of the presentation. And so our kind of pool of participants draws broadly from, again, international students from Asia who have been enrolled at some point this year at York or UBC. Midsummer, we expanded our participant pool to Asia more broadly. We began our research, Dr. Tungohan and I, with a focus on international students from Hong Kong and mainland China. And I can talk about this more in the Q&A, that posed some difficulties in terms of recruitment. And so we sought to expand it to Asia more broadly. This was also not just like a logistical consideration. There's also considerations around the category Asian that we wanted to ensure was part of our, the calculus of our decision-making around the participant pool, that Asianness more broadly, not just Hong Kong or mainland Chinese Asianness, is a kind of central plank in the racial discourse of COVID-19. And so the presentation that I'm giving today, my sharing of some preliminary results, draws primarily on some preliminary results from these focus groups. And I am particularly focusing on the UBC context, the focus groups that we've done at UBC, although there are significant overlaps with the kind of results that we've gathered from focus groups with York students. So let me then structure the rest of my talk around a couple of arguments. The first concerns the racialization and limitation of Asian utility. And this argument goes, we want to kind of put on the table that we need to understand the figure of the international student from Asia in the context of a much longer history of the construction of the figure of the Asian migrant to Canada. As Dr. Ethel Tungohan mentioned in the earlier keynote presentation that she delivered, international students more broadly have become a kind of new category of migrants to Canada that the Canadian government is relying on to fill all kinds of gaps demographically, but also economically and in terms of labor. And so in this argument, part of what we want to do is to recognize that international students more broadly, but in Asia particularly, have been invited and continue to be accepted in a very conditional way, in part due to their utility to the Canadian nation state and to Canadian institutions. And here, international students are useful in part because they are fee-paying bodies that aggressive internationalization efforts of universities to attract students from Asia are a means through which universities are dealing with the shortfalls budgetary of the kind of budget cuts that they have experienced as a result of neoliberalization. International students, like people of color more broadly, are also utilized as evidence of Canada's and universities' commitment to diversity and inclusion. So this is another kind of way that international students come to be figured as useful to the Canadian nation state and to institutions. However, this utility, as I mentioned, is conditional, and it is a conditional in the sense that Canadian settler white supremacy is part of what conditions this, this turn to a kind of capitalist utility and a multicultural utility. That in the context of COVID-19 certainly, but also more broadly, international students and other Asian migrants to Canada come to experience through their bodies the violence of the Canadian white settler state. And so part of what we want to do is to place the experiences of Asian international students within a longer history of yellow peril discourse in Canada and also in North America more broadly, where Orientalist discourses of Asianness figure Asianness as the source of danger and disease. And this is a source of danger and disease in relation to what is being endangered, which is whiteness. So in the Canadian white settler society, whiteness comes to be taken for granted as that which is in place, right? And this is of course policed. And in some ways, this yellow peril discourse also comes in the form of a kind of discourse of white replacement. Okay, so we might look at these kinds of images where historically Asianness have been figured as sources of danger. We have, the improper bachelor society on the left here, contrasted with the so-called typical home of a white working man. There's kind of heteronormative and racial and gendered differentiations happening. And on the image on the right, we have Chinatown being regarded as the source of all manners of disease, recalling existing kind of discourses around disease in relation to Asian bodies during the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. We have, as a result of this in the current context in COVID times, therefore a recycling or a reiteration of this longer history of yellow peril that manifests in part in anti-Asian attacks and violence against Asians, particularly in public space. We have quotes such as this: "Canada is going to get fucked by this virus. Have you seen University of Waterloo?" Idea being that universities with high Asian populations are evidence of the link between Asian bodies and ill health. And we have these tweets critically naming the unevenness with which COVID-19 is attached to certain bodies and not others, such that whereas Italy earlier on in the pandemic was subjected, well, experienced COVID-19, Italian businesses and spaces and bodies did not acquire the same kind of meaning that tweets like Connor Rowell's here put into play. So, and this is also partly a discourse of white replacement. So we have, and this is not new, ongoing debates around real estate and housing affordability, and the idea that Asians are taking over housing are also premised on this idea that housing is first and foremost white property, and anyone else, including Asians, who are tapping into that are doing so in the guise or in the form of white replacement. We have in 2010 an article from Maclean's magazine called Too Asian that approximates some of the logic that the tweet from Connor Rowell talks about, which is that some universities in Canada are much too Asian, which is an argument that by default, universities in Canada should be white, right? That there is this particular kind of excess that is at play here that is not acceptable. And then finally, this is we need to put this in the context. This is not the first time in 2010 that this happened. Some 40 years ago, there was a CTV article or a news segment called Campus Giveaway that talked 40 years ago about how universities in Canada are becoming much too Asian. And here, we need to think about the ways that Asianness gets collapsed into a singular category. In both the W5 and the Maclean's article, Asianness is collapsed into something singular without accounting for differences in citizenship, for example, and differences within the category Asian around nationality, language, geopolitics, class, etc. And this reproduces kind of a longstanding Orientalist idea of Asianness in a very simplistic way. I'm realizing now that I am probably out of time because it's been 15 minutes. But I wanted to maybe end with this last slide. I have many more. I only went to one argument instead of the two. But I want to end with this in part because I have 5 more minutes. Thank you, Brittany. In which case, I'm not going to end with this. Let me then continue by talking about this image, which is an image titled A Picture for Employers that mobilizes the same juxtapositional form as the other cartoon from earlier, comparing the kind of white heteronormative family with the father as the breadwinner and the worker to the racialized, monstrous masculinity of the Asian bachelor society on the left, right? And the image here is an economic image. It's one that is premised on the proper laborer being one that is a white breadwinner with a heteronormative family, right? And the title refers to the fact that employers exploit the monstrosity and the improper masculinity and improper heterosexuality of Asian migrant workers, which then manifests in terms of them stealing their jobs, the jobs of these white breadwinners. So part of what we want to do in this research is to think about the ways that this manifests in the current context in relation to Asian international students, and the way that Connor Rowell and the Too Asian article, as well as the experiences of Asian international students, speak to the durability of ideas such as these in the context of COVID-19. All right, so the second argument has to do then with the ways that we need to pay attention to the bodies and lived experiences of Asian international students, in part because it is through their embodied experiences that we can appreciate and think a bit more about the ways that the multiple crises of COVID-19 is intimately manifest, right? That these embodied experiences focusing on international students instantiate the unevenness of COVID-19. And to recall something that Dr. Tangohan mentioned earlier, there might be a discourse that we're all in this together, but we are not all in this together in the same way, that we are differentiated. And so the differentiated experiences of international students give us a sense of how racial citizenship and other kinds of social systems of differentiation affect the unevenness of the impacts of COVID-19. That COVID-19 is not just a biomedical and health issue, it is an issue and a crisis of racialization, where racialized bodies of Asian international students come to be rendered and policed out of place. And it is through their bodies, the effects of stress, anxiety, fear, etc., that they experience these kinds of renderings of racialization. I also want to mention that it is through their body that they negotiate these kinds of experiences of racialization through practices such as self-regulation and that sort of thing. All right, so what does this look like for international students? The international students we've interviewed so far at UDC talk about the losses that they are mourning in the context of COVID-19. Some of this relate to their classroom experiences, where they feel lonely because they don't have classmates to be in community with. They don't have professors with whom they can share ideas face to face. That they've lost a chance to be part of a social community, and that they experience this as a distance between them and their professors. They also talk about this in terms of a disruption in their progress and how that makes them feel in terms of pressure, stress, and depression. Particularly, they also name this as a particular kind of racial alienation in a student community that is particularly still, despite the demographic reality of multiculturalism, still very much coded as white. So we have students who worry about their classmates judging them because they're the only international student in their cohort, that their program feels alienating, particularly in the COVID context, because they fear that because they're Asian, COVID-19 will be attached to them in their bodies. Okay. They also talked about the uncertainty and the lack of clarity and accessibility of support systems. Funding was one concern, but also more broadly, the kinds of responses from the Canadian government that are difficult to navigate, and they're difficult to navigate in part because of the existence of language and cultural barriers that they don't feel that there is additional support with. Because they are international students and are conditionally in Canada, there is also an ongoing fear of violating policy and the possibility of violating policy then impacting their desire to possibly stay in Canada later on. So this is a fear of being deported. And so the conditional status of international students means that their capacity to investigate their the qualifications for these supports is affected by that conditionality. We are at time now, so I'm just going to end by mentioning some concluding thoughts around the ways that we need to think about COVID-19 in terms of the longer history as well as the kind of existing policy picture and societal systems within which we are doing this work. We didn't start from scratch in January, February, or March, that we need to account for the existence of these histories. And we need to think about ongoing responses to COVID-19 and whether we organize them in terms of citizenship. Some people are abandoned in those forms of responses. So Thank you very much for listening to my preliminary presentation. And I put up my email there should you have any questions that you want to ask me after the event. And also, if you are a UBC or York international students from Asia and you want to participate, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Catungal, for an incredible and very informative presentation. I'd like to remind all of our viewers that we'll be moving on to the next module, and the next presentation will be directly on Teachable. So we'll leave a link in the chat as well as on Twitter and on YouTube. So please do click there. We will be seeing Dr. Catungal once again at 5:30 for a live Q&A. So if you have any questions or would like to hear more from him, please do join us at 5:30 for the live Q&A. And again, we will be leaving all of the links and continuing to update our Twitter page. So if you need any information, please do head to that page and we'll be able to help you there. Thanks again, Dr. Catungal.